Imagine Sun Tzu not standing on a battlefield surrounded by banners and soldiers, but seated in a quiet room overlooking markets instead of mountains, watching the rise and fall of prices, the movement of capital, the psychology of crowds, and the silent wars fought every day between corporations, nations, and investors, because when you strip the art of war of its armor and spears, what remains is not a manual of violence, but a profound study of strategy, efficiency, timing, risk, psychology, and resource management, all of which sit at the very heart of finance and economics in the modern world. Sun Tzu begins by insisting that every conflict is won before it begins, a principle that in financial terms translates into preparation, research, and information asymmetry, because markets do not reward courage alone, they reward understanding, and just as generals who marched blindly were doomed, investors who deploy capital without understanding macroeconomic conditions, industry cycles, incentives, and human behavior are simply gambling under the illusion of strategy. When Sun Tzu says that war is a matter of life and death for the state, he is describing the same stakes that governments face when managing debt, currency stability, inflation, and growth, because a poorly planned economic policy can collapse a nation just as surely as a lost war. And this is why Sun Tzu's emphasis on calculation resonates so deeply with finance, as he speaks of measuring terrain, resources, morale, leadership, and timing, which today become balance sheets, cash flows, market sentiment, regulation, interest rates, and technological disruption. His famous line about knowing the enemy and knowing yourself becomes the foundation of competitive advantage in economics, because knowing yourself means understanding your own capital structure, risk tolerance, strengths, and weaknesses, while knowing the enemy means analyzing competitors, market forces, and substitutes, and if you lack either, defeat is only a matter of time. Sun Tzu's hatred of prolonged war mirrors the economic truth that long, drawn-out conflicts drain capital, erode morale, and destroy value, which is why in business and finance the most successful players aim for decisive moves rather than endless price wars or unsustainable growth fueled by debt, because time itself is a cost, and Sun Tzu understood opportunity cost centuries before economists gave it a name. Recognizing that resources tied up in one conflict cannot be used elsewhere, a lesson painfully clear to companies that burn cash chasing market share without a path to profitability. When Sun Tzu speaks of winning without fighting, he is offering perhaps his most powerful financial insight, because the greatest economic victories come not from crushing competitors openly but from shaping markets, influencing standards, building networks, controlling supply chains, and positioning so effectively that rivals are rendered irrelevant before open competition even begins, which is why dominant firms invest heavily in brand, ecosystems, patents, and regulation, turning potential battles into foregone conclusions. Sun Tzu's obsession with deception maps perfectly onto financial markets, where perception often moves prices more than reality, and where expectations, narratives, guidance, and signaling can create booms or busts long before fundamentals change, reminding us that markets are not purely rational machines but human systems driven by fear, greed, hope, and uncertainty. And this is why Sun Tzu would feel at home among traders, because he understood that psychology is a weapon, and that appearing strong when weak and weak when strong is not dishonesty but survival, just as central banks manage expectations through forward guidance, not merely through interest rates. Sun Tzu's teachings on adaptability resonate with the economic truth that no strategy survives contact with reality unchanged, because markets shift, technologies disrupt, and shocks arrive unannounced, and those who cling rigidly to old models, whether they are corporations refusing to adapt or governments defending outdated policies, suffer the same fate as generals who fight the last war instead of the current one. When Sun Tzu warns against attacking fortified cities, he is cautioning against frontal assaults on entrenched advantages, a lesson painfully learned by startups that challenge incumbents head-on instead of exploiting overlooked niches, asymmetries, or new business models, because attacking strength directly is expensive, risky, and often unnecessary. Sun Tzu's concept of terrain becomes an economic map of regulation, geography, culture, infrastructure, and institutions, reminding us that success in one market does not guarantee success in another, and that strategies must be localized, not copied blindly. When he emphasizes leadership and discipline, he is describing governance, incentives, and culture, which in modern organizations determine whether capital is allocated wisely or wasted, because no strategy, however brilliant, survives incompetent execution, and Sun Tzu's insistence on unity of command echoes in corporate clarity, where conflicting incentives, internal politics, and misaligned goals can sabotage even the strongest financial position. His insights into supply lines are directly applicable to modern global trade, where efficiency, redundancy, and resilience determine profitability and survival, as seen when fragile supply chains collapse under stress, proving that lowest cost is not always lowest risk. Sun Tzu's understanding of momentum is visible in markets where trends reinforce themselves, drawing in capital, talent, and attention, until a tipping point is reached, and wise strategists ride momentum rather than fight it, exiting before it reverses. When Sun Tzu advises choosing battles carefully, he is teaching capital allocation, because every investment is a choice not to invest elsewhere, and disciplined investors and governments alike must say no far more often than they say yes, preserving resources for moments of true advantage. Sun Tzu's belief that chaos contains opportunity is echoed in financial crises, where those with liquidity, patience, and courage can acquire assets at discounts, while the unprepared are forced to sell at the worst possible time. And this is why Sun Tzu valued reserves, because flexibility is power, and in economics, liquidity is freedom. When Sun Tzu speaks of morale, he is describing trust, confidence, and legitimacy, which underpin currencies, institutions, and markets, because once trust is broken, no amount of force can restore stability quickly, as history shows again and again during hyperinflations, bank runs, and sovereign defaults. Sun Tzu's emphasis on intelligence gathering is the ancestor of modern data analysis, research departments, and economic indicators, reminding us that decisions made in ignorance are not bold but reckless, and that the cost of information is almost always lower than the cost of being wrong. Perhaps most importantly, Sun Tzu teaches humility before complexity, understanding that uncertainty is not an enemy to be eliminated, but a reality to be managed, and this mindset is essential in finance, where overconfidence has destroyed empires and portfolios alike, and where the illusion of control is often more dangerous than ignorance. When Sun Tzu advises avoiding desperation, he is warning against leverage taken to extremes, because debt turns flexibility into fragility, forcing action at the worst times, and Sun Tzu knew that a cornered army fights fiercely but irrationally, just as over-leveraged firms and states make destructive decisions to avoid short-term pain. In the end, the art of war reframed through finance is not about domination but about sustainability, alignment, and wisdom, teaching that true victory is stability, prosperity, and resilience rather than spectacle, and that the greatest strategists are not those who win loudly, but those whose success appears inevitable in hindsight, because they understood incentives, timing, psychology, and limits. And in a world of volatile markets, rapid technological change, and global competition, Sun Tzu's ancient voice still whispers a timeless truth, that strategy is not about force, but about understanding the system so deeply that you move with it rather than against it, turning conflict into coordination, risk into opportunity, and uncertainty into advantage.